Hello YouTube, this is Spencer, this is an iPhone 8, and this is a charging port replacement. Today, the tools we need are right here. I'm not that great at video editing for right now, so I'm just going to use pen and paper. The tools are right here. You need a Pentalobe, Phillips, ideally 000, tri-wing screwdriver or a tri-wing bit, the standoff bit for the iPhone, some sort of tweezers, nylon spudger, an opening tool, and ideally a magnetic mat, but you can also use masking tape, just something that you can place the screws on that won't move, and some sort of heat source. I use a hot air gun, but a hair dryer or a blow dryer will work just the same. So let's get started. First, we start by removing the two Pentalobe screws. As a force of habit, I always start at the bottom. This is a technique that I use. As you can see right here, I'll try to get a close-up. The screen doesn't go in very far. You can sort of run your tool right along this line right here. A technique that I use is, rather than just running straight along, I'll go and then sort of lift up, and it makes it easier. You don't want to lift up too far because we have the flex cable for the screen and home button extension cable. You really don't want to open it up further than about this far. I usually start from the top, and you push down at an angle, twist, and then it comes right off. Now begins disassembly. Best place to start is with the screen, LCD, retaining plate, followed by the front camera retaining plate, the 3 screws are not always magnetic, or they may not stick to your Phillips the best. Sometimes you need to use tweezers. If you do, just make sure not to accidentally stick them in something. Incredibly important, vitally important. Whenever you are connecting or disconnecting anything from the device, you always want to make sure that the battery is disconnected. You can use a nylon spudger, or I just use my fingernail. Literally, you just pry right here, right underneath, lift up, light or medium amount of force. Same with the next thing to be removed is the front-facing camera and LCD, home button, flex cable. Once again, you can use a spudger or your fingernail. You come here, lift up on the home button, flex. Try not to lift up directly in front. There are components that are directly in front. You want to lift up from the side. Last thing we want to do is accidentally damage something. Same thing. Lift up with your spudger. Ideally, you should be lifting up approximately here, just for context. Assuming you don't gouge into it, it's relatively simple, relatively easy. Use a small amount of force, lift up. Set the screen aside. Now, there's no particular order in which you need to complete this next step. I usually start from left, right, bottom, but the board does need to come out, unlike previous models. Thank Apple for that. In the old days, previous to the iPhone 7, you could do this without removing the board, but, well, those days are long gone. Sorry, I'll try to keep it in frame. There's a screw right here. Set that aside. Two more. Set these aside. Now, I have a rather good memory, so I remember pretty much where all the screws go. Plus, I've also done this, I don't know, dozens, hundreds of times. But for all the people out there that aren't familiar with this, usually a rule of thumb, like I said, use a magnetic mat. I find it's most useful to set these screws next to the corresponding plate or part that they come out of. Usually it's easiest to put it back together. That's obviously the difficult part. Is disassembly is easy. It's how do I put everything back together without losing parts? Magnetic mat, everyone. Now we move on to the camera. Here's where your standoff bit comes in handy. I don't know if you can see that. Well, I assume you're seeing it because you're pulling it out of your phone, but if you have a flathead, that does work. They are a little bit more cumbersome, but you can use a flathead. Set that aside. While you have your standoff, I'd suggest taking out the other two screws. Now for the camera. There are components up and around here, but immediately bottom left, take your spudger, lift up, take your spudger, lift up. Now if you plan on doing this repair all in one setting, you can just set the camera and the motherboard aside. But if you plan on doing this over the course of a couple hours, or if you go to bed and pick this back up tomorrow, before you go to bed or before you step away, I'd suggest one of a couple of things, putting the camera in a small baggie along with the housing. The last thing you want to do is get dust on this lens or on the camera lens. Also, the motherboard doesn't hurt, as the last thing you want is dust or debris to get in any one of these connectors. Pretty much you can use your fingernail or a spudger, but lift up for the charge port. I usually lift up right here with your fingernail or a spudger. With this flex on the bottom, same thing, just straight up, ideally from this side. The wireless charging flex is slightly more difficult just because of this particular plate right here. Come in, lift up. Ideally, just for context, you want your tweezers to be close to the bottom right. Lift up, just like that. Next step is to remove the SIM card tray. I use my curved tweezers, push down. The visual is something like this. Just push straight in. It pushes the SIM card tray out. Once that's done, usually this little post right here, push that in. It'll make getting the motherboard quite a bit easier to get out. Like I said, if you're planning on doing this in one sitting, just set this aside and move on to the next, which is the charging port and all the components that are attached. In no particular order, just whatever works best for you. Just make sure to have decent screw placement. It's not immediately obvious, but you have 2 screws here and here. Two screws for the speaker. The one and only tri-point is this guy right here. Lift up this plate. You have one more standoff screw right underneath this metal piece. Pretty much the easiest thing to do here is lift up on the speaker. Sometimes it snaps. The flex right here will snap out of place. If not, take your spudger. I use a twisting motion. So try to expand on this. But you have the flex cable right there, as you can see. Take the speaker, set it aside. Last screw is the standoff. You have this tiny little flex, very light, just popped out. Don't want to lose that. Take this, set it aside. Your Taptic Engine connects to your flex cable, or the charging port flex. Same twisting motion. There's a little bit of adhesive right here. There's sort of a piece that sits on, this metal piece sits on top of the Taptic Engine, which is a part of the flex. Just use the flat part of your spudger, push down ever so slightly. Your Taptic Engine comes out. Now, depending on what it is that you're doing, there are some of you that are replacing the charging port, in which case it's not the end of the world to just use brute force and literally just rip the charging port out. For this example, I'm going to be slightly not so heavy-handed. Lift up. So this is where your hair dryer would come in handy. There's quite a bit of adhesive right here. Now, the majority of you are more than likely going to be using this video for a charging port replacement, but there are a small percentage that will have another issue, which I see from time to time, typically in, I don't know, anyone that works in the field, construction workers, near a military base. There are tons of Marines that get their speaker, the speaker holes, the mesh that sits in between the lower microphones gets incredibly dusty, and either that or the speaker, or the mesh that sits in between the outside world and the speaker will get so clogged that either the microphones and or speaker will become faint / muffled / sometimes they're barely audible. In this particular scenario, that's where you want to be incredibly light removing the charging port, because ideally you want to be able to reuse it. But for those of you that the charging port literally doesn't work and you have a replacement part, it's not the end of the world if you simply tear this out. But for this example, so like I said, I use a heat gun. Literally, you just use your spudger, run it along. There's the majority of the adhesive, as you can see, is between here, but there is a little bit right here. Like I said, for all of you that plan to reuse this charging port, make sure to be careful if for whatever reason you damage the front microphones, if they tear. I've seen it where one of them tears and then all of a sudden your lower mics don't work. And your lower mic serves the purpose of voice for voice memos and phone calls when you put it up to your ear. So not speakerphone, not Siri, not rear facing, not FaceTime audio. And this is your charge port. Let me get another one out of my kit and I'll be right back. Here's our new part. Depending on where you get it from, it comes with what seems like a unnecessary or ridiculous amount of plastic, but if you want the adhesive, all this is new adhesive. You want it to stick right to the inside of the frame. Lift up, get all this stuff off. A common mistake, if you rush through this, is to forget. You see all this adhesive right here and on the top. Something that I'm even guilty of this from time to time, and I do this for a living, is forgetting the lower microphone. And if you forget that, well, don't expect your microphones to work. On more than one occasion, I have put everything back together. I go to test the device before I finish the repair. I go to voice recorder, voice memos, and voice memos doesn't hear anything. Well, that's because your lower microphones and these two little pieces of film are standing in the way of you and success. So once you have all those pieces of film off, we can begin reassembly. Like I said, this is the hard part. This is where your screw placement comes in. This is where your screw placement matters. Just for context, I'll show you my screw placement. That's the charging port. This is for the top left of the board. LCD flex, front camera flex, rear camera flex. These three hold the board in. Obviously that's your SIM tray. That makes the most sense to me, but whatever the case, you do you. Just as long as you put it back together right. Now typically, this little part right here, sort of folded at a 90-degree angle. It'll help go in easier. Same thing with this piece right here. Sorry, I'll get a better angle on that. You don't need to exert much force. It just helps them stay in. Now, a little trick that I use is I'll put 2 screws in. Typically, I put in these 2 screws. And then I try plugging in the charging port. Ideally, you want to hear it snap. Once again, in my thousands of repairs that I've done, I have accidentally not, plugged it in right, or I haven't it's not aligned properly, in which case sometimes the charging port wants to sit at an angle. Ideally, it's needs to sit at a 90-degree angle, full contact. But this obviously seems to work. It has a nice feel to it. Once that's done, obviously if it's not, you want to loosen your screws. Sometimes I've seen it where I'll loosen it maybe a half a turn, then I will snap it in, and then I will tighten down these two screws and then try again. Just a little tidbit. Now, I will say this, the 7 Plus has these two little, or the 7 and the 7 Plus charging port has these two little alignment holes in the charging port, and they make it very easy to align the flex cable to the motherboard. Now, you can do one of a couple of things. Something that I do is I don't fully install the board, but I will take the board, drop it in, then I make sure that all of these holes are lined up properly, and ideally the tolerance for this particular flex cable is incredibly minimal. I've seen them be off by what I feel like is a half a millimeter, and it will not go in because it's too far to the left or too far to the right. Now, at least the technique that I do is, that I suggest on wider flex cables, is going from right to left, or right to left, or left to right. And as long as it lays flush, you want it to lay flush. If it's sticking up even just the tiniest bit on one side or the other, you'll lose some sort of functionality, whether it be Taptic Engine or loudspeaker or microphone, what have you. So make sure that it lays flush. If it doesn't lay flush, the reason that I take the board and I drop it in and snap this in properly is if, let's just say it's not done properly, if the flex cable is positioned too high or too low, then you have to undo all of those screws, which obviously is a huge pain in the neck, takes up a lot of time. So in my opinion, you're better off doing it before you put all the components back in. So this seems to work. Ideally, you want, this isn't exact, but this post should be centered directly in the middle of this hole in the flex. Once that's done, you can continue. Next, I start with the lower microphone. Now, the two lower microphones have alignment pins. This is my old, so I'll just show you right here, but there's an alignment pin. Try to get this, but you can see right here, and this little slot right here. Same deal with, it's easier to, this one is slightly different, but there's alignment pins. I'm gonna try to capture this on film. There's alignment pins, so you can barely see them, but they're right here. There's two on the bottom, one on the top. Let me see. This one and these two. Now they should slot in just like that. So this one's sticking up ever so slightly. You can see this is the alignment slot I'm referring to. So you just sort of nudge it in place, and voila. Sometimes you get it the first attempt, sometimes not. After this, I move on to the Taptic Engine. You sort of have to lift up this little piece right here, drop it in place. Usually I will install the 2 screws before moving on to connecting the flex, the Taptic flex to the charge port flex. Once that's done, that's your Taptic flex. Make sure it snaps into place before moving on to the next component. Now this plastic piece has a little groove that it fits into right here. It's supposed to stay flush. So I'm skipping a step. Getting ahead of myself. There we go. As you can see, this little plastic piece sits just under the edge of the frame. Now, yours might have remained in place, or sometimes I've ordered some charging ports where this particular piece is still in place. Depends on where you get them from. Some vendors sell OEM pull charging ports, that are pulled from working iPhones or whatever. Others are, this happens to be an aftermarket. I get them from Mobile Centrics. They didn't pay me to say that. I think they have great parts for how inexpensive they are. This is their premium line. I think the difference between their premium and aftermarket is maybe $5 or $6, which seems, on a small part, to me it just seems ludicrous to not spend the $6 extra and get a higher quality part that's not going to have issues with audio or any of the antennas, what have you. So we're back to here. We have this little piece. I don't know how to get that on camera. You kind of just have to snap it in place. Some of them go in easier than others, some of them don't. You have a little bit of flexibility as this does tilt back and forth, which is important for the next piece, which is your loudspeaker. So we need this flex cable right here to mate up with this connector. Another point of reference is obviously your posts, or this post right here, and these screw hole posts. Usually I drop these 2 screws in first before moving on. So you need to it's barely audible snap, but it snaps into place. If it's not, use your tweezers. So I'll undo this and I'll show you again, but you can lift up. So they wanna, there we go, hold on. So as you can see, that's that. It has a little bit of movement. Just make sure that, pretty much make sure it's right on top of the Taptic flex. Once it's in place, you just hear it snap into place ever so slightly. We can move on to the next couple of screws. Try to get this on camera. So usually what I do is I don't fully tighten these two. Until I get this last tri-wing or tri-point, whatever you want to call it. Remember, that is the only tri-point screw for a charging port repair. So by all means, once you're finished with that, set it aside, set it away, get it out of line of sight. I don't know. I'm picky with having too much stuff lying out at once. So once we're here, typically what I find is the easiest is to lift up on this antenna. Make sure your power flex is folded back ever so slightly. Make sure these flex cables are folded back ever so slightly. Now, I've seen this happen several times from even repair shops, from do-it-yourselfers, but you want this little piece right here, the board is supposed to go underneath, so you should be able to lift up on this afterwards. So that's a do, this is a don't. If you see you should see black on top of this, not the board. So you almost did it right there. I almost put the board on top of this flex connector. Typically the first thing that I do after putting the board in, make sure it lays flush. There's an alignment pin for reference right here. The other one is right here. If you didn't, put the speaker in off kilter, I've seen it where it won't align up with this post just right. If that's the case, you may need to undo a couple of screws. Make sure that this little post, this little thing sticking, this metal piece sticking out of the speaker aligns with that post hole. If that's done properly, then you can move forward, drop the SIM card tray in. Now at this point, once again, you don't have to do this in any particular order. Usually I will move on to these two standoff screws. Keep in mind, it's supposed to go standoff screw, little black plastic piece, and then board in that order. So if it's not, if the threads aren't catching the post underneath, make sure that you have it, make sure this plastic piece is on top of the board, not underneath it. There's a little bit of foam that's on top of this screw. By all means, I just remove it. It's not necessary. It's just Apple trying to hide screws. Once that's done, snap it into place. Next is the volume switch, power, rear camera, rear mic, flex cable. Snap that into place. Next is this little piece right here. As a general rule with most components, I don't tighten one screw all the way down until the other side lines up, or else you're just gonna have to untighten the screw just to force a habit. I don't like redoing work. I find it easiest to put in one of these 3 screws first before moving on here. Once again, that's just me. Move on to the other screws. Same thing, I don't tighten that screw all the way. I align this properly. Hold on. I align it properly. So sometimes if you tighten it all the way, you can, just make sure it's aligned properly. Then I tighten this. Then I tighten that. Once again, depending on, I mentioned this earlier, but I'll mention it again. Make sure that you don't have any dust sitting on the camera lens, or else you won't be able to take pictures. Well, I guess you will. But you will be able to take pictures, but it won't look as good. Make sure there's no dust. Reconnect the camera. Now, this particular standoff screw isn't very magnetic, so I use tweezers. There you go. Now we are left with these flex cables that need to be connected. You should hear an audible snap. I don't know if I got that on camera. So you may be tempted to connect your battery. If you do, immediately disconnect it, because we're going to have to connect the screen. And the last thing you want to do is, this is actually a very common issue on 6S and newer, now that the LCD and touch are one cable. If your device is connected to power and or turned on, the risk of blowing the backlight is, well, let's just say significantly higher than if the battery were disconnected. So make sure that the battery is disconnected. That is pretty much the last thing, not pretty much, it is the last thing, the last flex cable that we connect. Typically I start with the front camera flex. with some of these cables, some of the wider ones, I go from one side to the other, so right to left, left to right. Typically you don't want to just push down in the center, as you might not connect it properly. Then we're here. The home button, just snap that in the center. It's not wide enough to really matter. As for the LCD, typically I push down on the right, followed by the left. Make sure you hear an audible snap. Reconnect the battery, and the remaining retaining plates. Now, these 3 screws and this retaining plate is, well, let's just say it's not my favorite. These screws are far from magnetized. So more often than not, the first thing I try is taking a magnet, magnetizing the screw. If that doesn't work, pretty much you just gotta use your tweezers and set them in place. I'll use this as an example. So if I wasn't able to do that, this is a huge pain in the rear end, but you pretty much just have to set it in place. Then you come here. If you knock it out of place, you pretty much just have to set it back into place. There you go. Now, when you're reconnecting the screen, I'll try to point this out. You have these pieces right here. They connect. I probably won't be able to get this on camera, but they connect. So you always want to essentially, the screen is, I don't think I can do this with my hands, but basically the top goes in first, then you push up ever so slightly. Let me see if I can get this on camera better. So fold it over. You're left with this very thin gap. Push up. It should lay flush. After that, a common mistake is if the flex cables are sticking out for whatever reason, the last thing you want to do is shut the screen and pinch them. You're then going to have to replace the screen. Nobody wants to do that. Make sure they are sitting in. They should not extend beyond this silver rail. If they are, take a spudger, literally just push the flex in ever so slightly. Snap, snap. Finish it off with your 2 pentalobes. And you're done. Thanks, guys.